Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has unveiled a $500 billion economic stimulus package in a bid to ease the pain of inflation. Almost half of the total proposed spending will be set aside to help residents with the rising costs, as inflation in the country surpasses a three-decade high.
今回の対策は物価高克服、経済再生実現のための総合経済対策です。物価対策と景気対策を一体として行い、国民の暮らし、雇用、事業を守るとともに、未来に向けて経済を強くしていきます。
The package will include subsidies for households and support for businesses to raise wages. The government will also distribute coupons to families with newborn children. And the government hopes these steps will push down inflation and boost economic output. Mr. Kishida has been under pressure to do something about the cost of living crisis, as approval ratings have plunged in recent months. The depreciating Japanese yen also amplifying costs of imports for the resource-poor nation, putting more pressure on prices. The government says it will respond to excessive moves. The package comes as Japan's central bank retained its ultra-easy policy, defying a global wave of monetary tightening. The bank also hiked its inflation forecasts. And let's bring in Professor Seijiro Takeshita, and Professor of Management and Information at the University of Shizuoka. And he joins us live from Shizuoka, Japan. A very good evening to you, Professor Takeshita. So first of all, any big surprises in this stimulus package for you? What are the sectors that will be benefited from the stimulus package?
Well, I would have expected a lot more of a strategic long-term plan, because what Mr. Kishida has is what we call the golden 3 years without election, meaning that he could basically pounce on area that takes a longer time, thus structural transition, for example. But unfortunately, that's not the case. As you just reported, he's basically throwing cash at people's face, literally speaking. And again, as you reported, his popularity rating has now gone below 30%, which is a danger zone. So obviously, I think he's desperate and becoming a lot more of a populist. Now, answering your question, one area which I was impressed was his policy toward reskilling. In other words, relearning and trying to educate, workforces, labor forces, particularly, for example, like in the Middle Age era, to basically be accustomed with areas like DX. But overall, I am truly disappointed by the announcement today.
Mm-hmm. And are those supporting measures effective enough to reduce inflation while supporting economic growth?
I don't think so. In case of Japan, it's cost push inflation. In other words, inflation that's been caused by weakening the yen and rising, external prices such as oil. It's not demand pull, meaning that, our inflation situation isn't as serious as, for example, like in the States or in Europe. But that said, this level of yen is certainly going to hurt, various issues, and we'll gradually be feeling, this negativity coming through. In regards to, for example, supporting the subsidy of electricity and gas, it's very much unified, and it's not really concentrated, for example, to support the weak and the poor. It's basically unified, meaning that, everybody gets to benefit from it, which again, my point is that, they should have basically rectified and basically sorted, the degree of endurance a lot more. In other words, there should have been a lot more careful planning that took place. But no, I really get the impression that, it doesn't have a lot of multiplier to the economy. That's the over impression that I got.
Well, despite the despite the negative impacts you mentioned, and also the extra spending will certainly add more financial burden to Japan, which is now struggling to rein in the largest public debt load in the developed world. So what matters now actually is how long the government can continue with its this kind of approach to fight inflation with fiscal spending, isn't it?
Basically, after this plan was announced, I would have expected, many to voice out what you just pointed out. But unfortunately, there aren't too many, meaning that the Japanese are becoming very numb to the situation. Look what happened in the United Kingdom, for example, for coming out with a plan that is very careless as far as funding is concerned. And look what happened to their, financial system. So, in case of Japan, we're being very numb to this, debt to GDP ratio of over 200%. And the fact that, today's plan, great majority is going to be a debt for the next generation. So, these things, the long-term issues of how we're going to fund this is something that should be in the center of argumentation, but it's not. And this, in my opinion, is a very big danger sign that I see.
Yeah, worth looking out. And also the stimulus package came on the same day the Bank of Japan stuck with its rock-bottom interest rates. So what do you make of this combination?
Well, the fact of the matter is that, Bank of Japan doesn't have the deep pocket that many people believe, I think. Their current account has swelled by 170 billion yen in the past 2 years, reaching almost 600 trillion yen. Meaning that, they really cannot have the maneuverability as, for example, other central banks. And again, our economy isn't really back on its feet. And for that reason, it's very, very difficult for them to even think about rate rise. So, there's going to be a continuous disparity, which is a bad cycle because obviously interest rate deviation is going to continuously take place, which means that there is a potential of yen weakening even further, which goes back to our initial talk that, it could hinder various parts of our economy because of that.
Well, all right. Thank you, Mr. Sojiro Takeshita, a professor of management and information at the University of Shizuoka.